Airing first on Asheville FM. In Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week on The Final Straw, we're presenting two conversations. The first was a chat with workers from the local plant-based protein company, No Evil Foods. The company has been getting flack for using social justice imagery while working to undermine unionization efforts at its factory here in Asheville, North Carolina. The workers talk about strategies, WSFM-LP 103.3, that they took in organizing attempts and experiences they had with disinformation about collective bargaining from the management and the union-busting consultants in their employ. In order to protect the anonymity of the workers, we've replaced their voices with our own. See our show notes for a script of the chat. Although not affiliated with the unionizing effort, the Fedbook page for the Asheville Solidarity Network hosts some of the flyers in support of workers unionizing No Evil Foods, as well as the local mission hospital system. It's also acting as a hub for posts about mutual aid responses to COVID-19 and the coronavirus crises in the Asheville area. For more information and resources in different places around solidarity and mutual aid in this intense time, visit itsgoingdown.org. To see a few pictures about the propaganda distributed by No Evil Food to No Evil Food workers, check out our show notes, including a couple of links to some audio that was recorded at a mandatory meeting that workers were forced to sit through. After that, you'll hear a conversation with Garrett, an anarchist involved in Pipeline Legal Action Network, based in so-called Minnesota. PLAN has recently published a legal workbook for people planning around resisting pipeline infrastructure expansion, in particular with the Line 3 pipeline. The guide also brings together a lot of other useful resources for any crew or affinity group and is available for free at planline3.com alongside a lot of other material. And now here are a few announcements. On Sundays at 4 p.m. at 644 Haywood Road in West Asheville, just around the corner from Firestorm Books, a project calling itself Hot Potatoes is offering free hot meals from reclaimed and donated ingredients to the community, as well as free produce when available to them. Also, grand jury resistors Chelsea Manning and Jeremy Hammond have been ordered released from the Arlington, Virginia jail, where they've been held while refusing to participate in federal grand juries concerning WikiLeaks and the attempted extradition of Julian Assange. This came days after Chelsea allegedly attempted self-harm or suicide in her cell under the stress of nearly a year in prison, and that being only a year after being released from a military prison. Amazingly, although the government was imposing a fine of thousands of dollars for each day of her incarceration for refusal, within a few days of her release, a crowdsourced fundraiser paid off the remaining $267,000 or so in fees that she was facing when she went home. Jeremy Hammond, meanwhile, is being transferred back to federal prison, where he will resume his last few months of incarceration. His time was put on hold during his resistance to the grand jury. More about Jeremy's case and how to write him and letters of support can be found at freejeremy.net, and more about Chelsea is up at releasechelsea.com. Starting Monday, I Walk and Fight Toxic Prison chapters will be opening a hotline for prisoners to call in the so-called U.S. to report outbreaks, denial of adequate medical care, and other circumstances related to the coronavirus. To allow for the calls to be free to prisoners, fundraising is now happening. You can learn more at bit.ly/COVID-19prison. Anarchist and anti-fascist prisoner Eric King is fighting a possible 20-year charge added to his remaining time. In recent disclosures, he talks about his targeting by prison staff at FCI Inglewood, who threatened him and his family during visiting time, including consciously sitting his partner and their 2 children near sex offenders during the visitation, rather than in a separate family section. In his statement to the court, Eric says that when he attempted to use the prison's own complaint mechanisms, he was further targeted for assault and harassment by staff, including continued harassment about his family, threats that fall under the protections afforded by the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, of 2003, interferences with his ability to communicate with his family and his lawyers, removal of his personal and legal items, and more. You can read the whole thing up at supportericking.org, where you can also find a link to the fundraiser for his legal defense to fight this 20-year hit that he might face. The fundraiser is found also at fundraiser, that's fundrazr.com/E1C K01. To hear an interview with Eric King that we conducted last year, some of which talks about some of these circumstances, check out our website. Finally, for the month of April 2020, the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement and others will be trying to focus attention on the Lucasville Uprising death row case of Bomani Shakur, a.k.a. Keith Lamar. He's been held for almost 18 years for charges related to the uprising and has been denied the ability to effectively challenge his death sentence, even though the state recognizes that it withheld potentially exculpatory evidence in his initial conviction. You can learn more about his case and how to get involved in the month of action for Bomani at revolutionaryabolition.org, or check out his own personal support page up at keithlamar.org. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a
I saw it reported in the mainstream media that Chelsea Manning attempted to kill herself. And as this is recorded, there are reports that Chelsea has since been released from custody. Not sure if that means she's been released completely or just transferred from one state of captivity to another. So, some background for anyone living under a rock. While in military service, Chelsea encountered stored data that she found disturbing. Information about how the U.S. was conducting itself in foreign wars and diplomacy. This information ended up splattered all over WikiLeaks. Chelsea was then subjected to really draconian isolation for a duration of years. She was eventually sentenced for a crime as a consequence of exposing the United States government. She did her time, and she got out. Problem is, Chelsea didn't shut up and disappear. She's been vocal and critical, and what she says seems to resonate with broader and broader audiences. So when the Trump administration began its witch hunt into Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, they used that as an opportunity to grab Chelsea Manning and attempt to compel her testimony before a grand jury. This is a tactic that's been used on anarchists and environmental activists again and again, turning grand juries into a weapon. When Chelsea Manning refused to testify, this became the excuse for locking her back up and subjecting her to more fascist mindfuckery. They also grabbed Jeremy Hammond, who allegedly engineered the Stratford dump, hacking into the Department of Defense and posting all the material online. He's serving a 10-year sentence for having been a teenager that was smarter than the entire Defense Department. Jeremy told the federal grand jury to go fuck itself, too. So, both he and Chelsea were being held in federal detention somewhere in Northern Virginia. And just a quick cul-de-sac here, but this witch hunt and this persecution is being conducted by the Department of Justice under the Trump administration. A president who one time praised Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and has often complained himself of Justice Department witch hunts and persecutions. So, just an observation for anyone who didn't already know that Donald Trump is a supreme douchebag. At any rate, that's the situation that led to Chelsea Manning's attempted suicide. Chelsea was previously locked up for exposing the truth, which has always been a punishable crime in this unfree country, and she has been, for months and months now, locked up for refusing to tell the truth. Seems if Chelsea tells the truth, she gets locked up, and if she refuses to tell the truth, she gets locked up. But it's more than that. The FBI has perfected domestic torture, taking a playbook from the CIA Counterintelligence and Interrogation Manual. I know, because I was subjected to it. Check out the audio of my testimony in an international court posted at swainrocks.org, posted as OAS testimony, where I exposed the FBI and the domestic torture program. What I'm suggesting to you is that the FBI is committing crimes against humanity, torture, and I'm suggesting that it's a very real possibility that Chelsea Manning was subjected to the very same conditions, a program designed to disassemble a human personality and create such psychological torment as to drive her to suicide, to self-murder. And they succeeded. This is the agenda of the monsters who run the United States government. They drove Chelsea Manning to suicide, and we didn't stop them. It's possible that after this suicide attempt, Chelsea's been released. But if so, it's only because the fascists in power fear the optics on all of this, and they're giving Chelsea a temporary respite while everyone is looking. And even so, this means we live in a world where the only way to make those in power stop torturing us is to kill ourselves. That's our world. We seem to be accepting it. We live in a country where there are more firearms than adults. And Saudi Arabia just started an oil war with Russia, so gas is even cheaper, and matches are still free. Yet, again, this is our world. Again, we seem to be accepting it. So just an observation here. But even if they've released Chelsea Manning, that doesn't mean they've decided conclusively to stop waging war on her very existence. And they've still got Jeremy Hammond held captive at the same facility. I guess that brings me to the only question that really matters. What the fuck are we going to do about it? Free Chelsea Manning, permanently. And free Jeremy Hammond, permanently. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks.
Would you care to introduce yourselves for the purposes of this conversation and what your relationship with No Evil Foods in Asheville is?
All of us work in the production area of No Evil Foods. This means that we're directly responsible for measuring and mixing the ingredients, running the mixes through the machines, cooking the mixes into the product, cooling the product, portioning the product, and boxing the product so it can be shipped out.
Can you talk about the situation? What were the working conditions like at No Evil Foods when active talk of unionization started? How was the response from the workers?
Active talk of unionization began at least as early as the summer of 2019. At that time, one of the shift supervisors on second shift was spearheading the campaign and was very vocal and open about it. He had even apparently gone directly to management asking them to recognize the union. At that time, employees had no health care, and there was no shift differential for second shift. Those were two major concerns that were eventually addressed, but the biggest reason for desiring a union was simply for the production team to have a seat at the table when it comes to future changes. The company is going through a huge growth period right now, and the production employees that make up the vast majority of the workforce are caught up in the undertow, so to speak. In response to the initial unionization campaign, management gave a speech about how they felt unions weren't right for the company. Mere weeks later, they changed the production schedule from a 4-day work week to a 5-day work week with monthly mandatory Saturdays. Dozens of production team workers quit in response, and the unionization campaign seemed forgotten. However, reps from the union reached out to workers who had signed cards, and eventually we began to seek out more signatures and discuss the ongoing need for representation. The response from workers varied, of course, but there was no hostile conversation about it among employees before the union-busting tactics started. Some weren't sure what a union actually did and the protection it offers. Others had only heard negative things. But the more it was discussed between production workers, the more we felt as though we had a decent chance to bring everyone together for this cause. The open dialogue was almost always positive, and many employees were excited and curious about the possibility of being able to have a greater say in their working conditions, pay, benefit, etc. This is the Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You're listening to a conversation with workers from No Evil Foods for the sake of protection of the workers who have been trying to organize and have been repressed for their organization of a union. We've re-recorded their voices.
How did No Evil Foods respond to talk of workers organizing themselves or joining a union? Who did they hire to bust the effort, and what has that looked like? What union were you working with?
We really have no way to know for sure when management found out that we were attempting to unionize, but we have theorized that it was probably around December or January. It's likely that their first attempt to deter a, quote, need, unquote, for a union was to find out what we wanted and attempted to give it to us. In January, they gave night shift a pay differential. They made sure night shift was getting out on time and not staying late, as had been the trend. They even added an employee award program to give us each a free gift. This was the start of what would be a serious manipulation campaign. When management was officially informed that we had filed with the NLRB, the first poster we were handed was about union cards. The word dues was mentioned nearly 10 times. Quote, union authorization cards are legal documents. Quote, do not sign a union card unless you're willing to accept all the possible consequences of unionization. Unquote. Quote, union representatives are salesmen. Unquote. Quote, collective bargaining involves give and take and is a risk. Unquote. Ironically, this flyer started out by assuring us that No Evil just wanted to give us all the facts to help us make an informed decision. This theme of wanting us to make an informed decision was a consistent talking point throughout the entire campaign, even though what they were actually doing was trying to drastically misinform us. It didn't stop there. On top of the flyers, the main response by management was to bring us into captive audience meetings. These meetings were mandatory and involved each shift being corralled into a dimly lit room and subjected to various PowerPoint presentations about unions. The topics varied, but the information was always slanted, with a lean towards either being anti-union or being neutral, never positive. One meeting went over the legalities of a union constitution, which felt like an attempt to just confuse everyone with an hour's worth of legal lingo. Another meeting was about the UFCW and how much those at top make. Curiously, nothing was mentioned about how much those at the top of No Evil food chain make. Another meeting was all about collective bargaining. Demonstrating just how biased these meetings were, an employee at the collective bargaining meeting asked if there were any benefits, and the speaker had nothing positive to say. The very last of these meetings was about the investors of No Evil and how the owners, Mike and Sarah, can't control, they said, quote, can't control, unquote, what they might do in response to a union. This was a meeting that essentially scared the piss out of everyone, and many of us believe that this was the meeting that really tipped the scale. People walked out of that meeting truly fearing that they would lose their jobs and the warehouse might shut down if the majority of eligible voters said yes. Essentially, either by design or by coincidence, these meetings were all designed to play on a very specific fear of the workers. Fears about sexual harassment and how the union might make it harder to get rid of stalkers. Fears about not understanding the union constitution and its legalities. Fears about collective bargaining. Quote, you may get more, you may get less, unquote. Fears about job security and how the warehouse might close down if we end up moving forward with unionizing because the investors might not like it. To answer the question about who they hired, the lawyers' names are Lee E. Tyson and Jonathan Martin, both from the firm Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Profede. From their website, quote, we can help you realistically assess the employee relations atmosphere in your workplace environment. We can help you build and foster the kind of workplace environment in which a union is irrelevant. We know it doesn't pay to be the proverbial bull in the china shop. Even as we advise management on union organizing drives and decertification efforts, we have maintained professional relationships with the unions. We are not known as, quote, union busters, unquote, nor do we want to be. The firm has particular strength in collective bargaining and negotiation experience. We take pride in knowing the subtle differences, like when to be tough, and we can be extremely tough, and knowing when a non-adversarial approach is in the best interest of the clients, unquote. They're not union busters, and yet, coincidentally, they specialize in union avoidance campaigns. To answer the other question about which union, it was the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, aka the UFCW. This was Local 1208, based out of Tar Heel, North Carolina.
Can you talk about some of the rumors management and the lawyers have been fostering about unions, including the weaponizing of fears of sexual harassment at the workplace?
One of the first rumors was about drug testing, specifically about the union coming in and drug testing everyone. No Evil does a fairly noble thing and hires felons. It also doesn't drug test. So between those two things, the fact that a rumor was started about the union deciding to randomly drug test everyone, which would not happen unless we voted for it, to happen or the company pushed for it to happen. Could be a coincidence, or it could be evidence of management playing on the fears of workers.
So management offered to get No Evil Foods living wage certified. What does that mean? How does that measure to the cost of living index for Asheville? And is there a significant difference with what a union might help with?
One of the first rumors was about drug testing, specifically about the union coming in and drug testing everyone. No Evil does a fairly noble thing and hires felons. It also doesn't drug test. So between those two things, the fact that a rumor was started about the union deciding to randomly drug test everyone, which would not happen unless we voted for it to happen or the company pushed for it to happen, could be a coincidence, or it could be evidence of management playing on the fears of workers. No Evil Food is determined to be, quote, living wage certified, unquote, by Just Economics, a regional membership organization based in Asheville that has a voluntary certification process to determine if an employer pays what is considered a living wage in the area. When you look into the requirements to be living wage certified according to Just Economics, it's very interesting what that actually means. The way this is determined is through what's called the, quote, universal living wage formula, unquote. To be brief, it's based on the idea that one employee who works 40 hours a week should not have to spend more than 30% of their gross income on housing. While No Evil Foods pays better than most places in the area, anyone who has or currently lives paycheck to paycheck can tell you that this formula does not account for utility bills, expensive emergencies, monthly payments for necessities like a car or a phone, or childcare. It's not to say that No Evil Foods isn't taking a step in the right direction in this regard, but it would be naive to assume that their living wage certification accurately reflects the living costs of their lowest paid employees. A union could have drastically changed the lives of all production workers at No Evil. The mere opportunity to get a say in wages and benefits is something that every workplace should strive to achieve. While the idea of using a formula that assumes everyone fits into the same box when it comes to living expenses isn't a bad place to start, no arbitrary certification program or employer knows what their paycheck-to-paycheck employees truly need to be paid in order to thrive in today's economy.
The push to counter or bust unionization among the workers at No Evil Foods seems to fly in the face of the ethical image they push as not only a producer of vegan alternative proteins and their leftist imagery. How does that feel, and how have you seen this conversation happening?
Being vegan means something different to everyone, but at its core definition, it should be about maximum harm reduction to all living things, animal or human. Even the No Evil Foods mission statement reads, quote, "No evil exists to empower people to make positive change for themselves, the environment, and the welfare of animals through awesome food. Do no evil is the crux of what we do and the center of all of from which all good emanates. We're family-founded, majority woman-led, human-centered, and purpose-powered, and we're determined to bring people closer to the origins of their food while addressing issues like food insecurity, economic justice, and climate change. At the Axis No Evil Foods home base, we cut through the noise, speak our truth, and attempt to change the world one bite at a time," unquote. Empowering people should include empowering their workers, and empowering their workers should be about more than monthly team meetings and a suggestion box where we leave mere suggestions. The truest way they can live up to their mission statement, and it's still not too late to do the right thing, would be to empower their workers and allow them to unionize. It would mean allowing their workers to have a collective voice in day-to-day decisions. Back that mission statement up with radical action to prove it.
A common business model in Asheville these days, at least among breweries, seems to be to build a brand and sell it off to a bigger company once it's out of debt and expanded. There's been speculation about why the ownership/management might push so hard back on attempts to structurally raise standards for the workers at No Evil Foods because of a fear of spooking the investors. Speculating, does that seem like a possibility in this case, and how would leveraging for working conditions differ between a locally owned versus larger employer?
It's absolutely a possibility. Leveraging with employers, whether they be a small, family-owned company or a massive corporation, will never be a simple task if the position of management is to put the bottom line above all else. Historically, though, large corporations are notorious advocates for nothing but profit at the expense of their employees. Having a solidified contract in place at this stage would protect us from this, if in fact it is their plan in the future. It's worth noting that one of the captive audience meetings, we were told by Mike, one of the two owners, quote, "It's a very real risk that having a union at No Evil Foods would greatly impact our ability to continue raising capital, which risks the survival of our business. To be frank, I had one of our current investors saying this week, quote, I've seen hundreds of companies come across my desk, and I've never seen an investment in a unionized startup, especially not at this stage. If I was looking at this business for the first time, I would run the other way, unquote, unquote." So why did he say this? Because if this speculation about the inevitable selling of No Evil Foods is true, if a large corporation were to buy them out, this large corporation would have to listen to its employees who already had a solidified contract of employment that directly benefits the workers.
Word on the street is that workers are talking union at the local healthcare system called Mission, which is a huge employer around here and was recently purchased. What would you say to your coworkers at No Evil Foods or workers at Mission or elsewhere who might be considering a struggle for workplace union?
Do a Google search for Union Busting Playbook and inoculate your coworkers to the tactics and talking points that they will inevitably be subjected to. Maintain solidarity with your coworkers and constantly find new ways to draw more people into the organizing committee or the primary core of people responsible for the drive. Organize casual get-togethers outside of work. Strong bonds between workers are the best self-defense against any nonsense management decides to pull. Be resilient, be calm, and do your research. Know the ins and outs of the union, and be able to answer questions people will inevitably have. Be ready to be yelled at. Be ready to be threatened. Be ready to be manipulated and gaslit. There's no bar too low that management won't stoop to in order to get people to turn away from unionization, as many of us have found out. Communicate to coworkers that your struggle to organize your workplace has far-reaching effects for workers in the region. You aren't just empowering yourself. You are taking part of the historical struggle that's been waged for years. You're fighting for our collective future. And one more piece of advice to current and future organizers: record your captive audience meetings. It's a safeguard in exposing these union busters and showing the public how all these talking points and strategies are the same in so many ways is incredibly important.
Will you continue working and struggling at No Evil Foods even after this vote against a union? Why?
We said this many times during the campaign, but this is not the worst job we've ever had. There are some really awful places out there to work, and while this one definitely has its problems, it's not among the worst. Unfortunately, this was often used against us as an argument by management, i.e., even union organizers have said themselves that this isn't a bad place to work, so why do we need a union? They didn't really understand why we wanted a union. North Carolina, being a right-to-work state, was one of them. In the months since the election concluded, 4 people were fired. It's also fair to say that about 98% of the production workers haven't been there for more than a year. A telltale sign of a company where job security isn't really something prominent. On top of that, management often makes decisions rather willy-nilly. The top-down approach creates a lot of problems. Yes, there are always ways for us to suggest different ways of doing things, but suggestions are suggestions, and management always has the option to ignore us. Collective bargaining would have given us a voice that couldn't be ignored, and management proved by hiring union avoidance consultants that they're not really interested in taking what we have to say seriously. So to answer the question, yes, I think a lot of us will stay there and continue fighting for this. But I also think that for many of us, including some no votes who are slowly coming around and realizing that they were misled, there's not a day we walk into work and don't expect to be fired for something trivial. Management has fallen back to the same patterns that brought the union in to begin with. The firings only prove that we don't have job security. The random day-to-day changes and new policies and procedures only prove that we need collective bargaining and ultimately a union. For a company that markets itself like No Evil Foods does, union busting shouldn't be the kind of problem that it was during the campaign. Either the company takes off the mask and stops pretending to be revolutionaries who care about their workers, or they step up and do the right thing and help their workers form a union. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Burse. You just heard my conversation with workers from No Evil Foods here in Asheville about union busting at their workplace. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Rebel Steps is a podcast about taking action. Season 1 offered insights into how individuals can join movements. Season 2 focuses on the ways people can work together to build these movements. Organizing in groups presents many challenges. How do you care for each other and protect each other in the midst of political struggle? How do you lift up the voices of everyone in your group? How do you work through the inevitable disagreements? All of these questions have complicated answers. As I explore these questions, you'll hear voices and stories from my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, Outlive Them, Pop Gem, Democratic Socialists of America Libertarian Socialist Caucus, and more. Just like the first season, I return to Paulo Freire's quote, "What can we do today so that we can do tomorrow what we cannot do today?" But this time with the realization that building our capacity will necessarily happen alongside others. Find Rebel Steps on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts, and check us out on Twitter or Patreon.
Another housekeeping announcement is we're approaching our 10th anniversary of doing the show. So May of 2020 marks the 10th anniversary of the weekly anarchist radio show and podcast, The Final Straw. Over that time, we produced approaching 500 hours of audio, spent countless hours researching and editing and thinking about the project, and anyone with us for this ride will have seen it change and shift as the producers have, and as the culture around anarchy has as well. In many past years, our early May birthday episode, as we call it, has featured introspection on the format of anarchist audio and video production by projects we appreciate. Last year, you heard the two main people behind the show, William and myself, talk about the project and what we hoped might come of it, what we enjoy and what stresses us out. It was fun for us to step out of the role of inquisitor and become the subject of the chat. As our 10th birthday approaches, we thought we might try something novel. We'd like to invite listeners to record voice memos about what The Final Straw has meant to them, what they'd like to see from it, and any moments that stand out and the like. We won't promise to air everything, but we'll happily share a lot of what we get from y'all. So you can leave us a Signal voice memo or voicemail at 828-571-0161. We can take regular voicemails too there. Or you can email a link of MP3 audio via WeTransfer.com to our email address, thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, or send us a file over Google Drive affiliated with that email address. We'll be taking submissions between now and April 1st or so. And you can find all that contact information linked in the show notes. But we'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much. And next up, you'll be hearing from Garrett from Pipeline Legal Action Network. I'm joined by Garrett, who is working on the Pipeline Legal Action Network, and we're going to talk about the group's work and the recent publication, Book One Pre-Action. Thank you so much for chatting, and is there any other way that you'd like to identify yourself for the audience?
I'll just say that Plan is a group of folks out of the Twin Cities in Minnesota here, and we're a crew with varying amounts of legal experience, and we're just trying to bring that as an offering here for pipeline resistance work. And so we're excited to make our contribution and just really humbled by all of the amazing work going on around us that we get to play our small part in.
I always think that the ways that people that face, I mean, you didn't come out of nowhere when you or were part of that case, but would you mind telling us briefly how you got involved in anti-repression and legal movement work?
Sure, yeah, so back in around 2006, I was a part of a group called the RNC Welcoming Committee that was preparing for the Republican National Convention in St. Paul, Minnesota. And for our organizing, we had our homes raided and we were charged with conspiracy to riot and furtherance of terrorism. And so that was in 2008, and I spent the next 2 years fighting those charges, in which time there was other related cases that developed, federal grand juries, a lot of other state-level cases. So I participated greatly in my own defense as well as the defense of those other folks. And then as the sort of RNC started to wane, a lot of us continued to develop and use our legal skills in supporting other folks. So I continued to work with Anarchist Black Cross and peripherally with a lot of other defendants around the country that sort of emerged, as well as folks in the Twin Cities who needed some extra support with their legal issues.
Cool. Could you tell a little bit about like who all is involved in Plan, like what groups affiliate into it?
Well, so it's a pretty ad hoc group right now, though we're working closely with a lot of other different organizations around the Twin Cities and the state, both more formal organizations and affinity group organizations and kind of everyone in between that either is facing legal issues or concerned about the legal issues that they might have. So we do a lot of know your rights trainings, jail support trainings, and just kind of walking people through the steps once they are facing some sort of legal consequences.
And would you mind saying a few words about the shared values that you have represented in the pre-action book that you published? I think they were pretty informative and interesting.
We put a lot of thought into why it is that we're doing the work that we're doing, bringing a anti-colonial, anti-authoritarian, sort of anti-statist approach, because, we're mostly directly fighting the Line 3 pipeline here in Minnesota, but, we see the Line 3 struggle as an anti-colonial struggle, as well as, an anti-extractive and thereby anti-capitalist struggle. So we want to struggle in a way that's not just suggesting that we replace oil barons with energy barons and keep the same social order. We want to be empowering people to, take control and take back the power to have self-determination and to free our land of these sort of like extractive industries.
So you've mentioned Line 3 a couple of times. Can you tell listeners about what Line 3, like whose land it cuts through and what it'll be, what they are proposing, which it will not in fact carry because we are going to do such a good job to stop it?
Right. Enbridge, who's the company that wants to build it, their propaganda is sort of stating that it's a replacement line to an existing Line 3. And we argue that that is not the case, that it's, designed to carry a lot more, and that actually what they should be doing at this point is decommissioning the Line 3 that exists as opposed to building new fossil fuel infrastructure. So the current Line 3 and this new one are being built to carry tar sands from Alberta, Canada, through Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin. And specifically in Minnesota, it's cutting through and around a lot of indigenous reservations, Red Lake, White Earth, Leech Lake, Fond du Lac, and all through 1855 treaty territory. Much of it is following existing utility corridor, but a lot of it is new easement that's being cleared to make way for the pipeline. What's notable for us here in Minnesota is that it's basically for the profit of this company that's taking stuff out of Canada, taking it to the coasts for export. So it's especially this sort of socialism for the wealthy, capitalism for the rest of us, where, we're being expected to pay the price in terms of the land here and the environment here for the profit of this Canadian company and its shareholders. And we get nothing. It's not about energy independence for anyone. It's about profit for Enbridge.
So it's proposed for, well, obviously it's export from so-called Canada, but
right.
Where's the eventual market that stuff is bound for? Do you know? Is it just the U.S.?
No, it's for export, around the world. So the Line 3 specifically ends at Superior, Wisconsin, which is a sort of internal port where it's then moved on to the coast, either through other pipelines for the most part. But it's being moved as this dirty tar sands oil, and that's actually just not that desirable for folks who can get easier to process, cleaner burning energy source. So that's a big part of why it's being taken out of the States.
Mm. So you mentioned that it crosses the line, the made-up line between so-called Canada and the so-called U.S. Who's the audience for this guide that y'all are publishing, and does the strategy and approach of PLAN address the differing court systems that will be attacking water defenders?
I think this is mostly targeting grassroots organizers and affinity group members that are kind of trying to figure out how they are going to strategize, what they're likely to face, so that when they're planning their actions, they can plan through all the way to the end. That an action doesn't end when you leave the site of conflict, especially if there's arrests, if there's people that are going to have to spend years with court charges, if there's people that are going to potentially spend years in prison or under state supervision. And so you have to understand that if we're going to win, we have to gain more than we lose. And so we have to be able to come out of these situations stronger than we went in. And so the guide is kind of to help people think through what they need to do in order to stay strong as they're acting boldly. So in terms of the specific laws, we do have a lot of information that's know your rights stuff that is mostly US based, but really the bulk of the guide is less about specific laws and more about strategies for thinking about how you engage with the legal system. You can go and find a lawyer anywhere that will kind of tell you what they think the law says, and working within the law what they think might be helpful through that lens of the legal system. What we at PLAN are specifically interested in, and what I think we're uniquely able to provide support in, is looking at the legal system through a political lens. What type of actions can you do in and outside of the legal system to help advance your political goals? That's something that we reference in the guide, and are appreciative of the work of the Tilted Scales Collective that put together a defendants guide to talk about goal setting for defendants, and that's really important. And the way we kind of see our work is trying to fill that gap then between planning an action and now you're a defendant, to try to say, hey, there's a whole list of things that can happen before you're a defendant in a case that can better position you to make strong decisions and be more successful in your goals at the point that you are a defendant.
So the last decade has seen a lot of, especially the last 5 years, has seen a lot of large mass legal defense cases, or a few at least. Primarily the two that pop into my mind, partially from our previous conversation, are Standing Rock and also the J20 case. How do you think, and yeah, big ups again to Tilted Scales for that guide and its timing being available and helping folks work through a strategy for the J20 case, but how do you feel like the movements have been doing around supporting people through the process and beyond the process of legal engagement? And what are some of the things that, in particular, like your collective is trying to address?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question, and I think I have some personal thoughts on it that I think are, that because as we get into, theories about how change is happening in this historic moment, I think reasonable minds can disagree, and we can find common ground on how we generate tools to kind of navigate the current moment that we're in and move in a more successful manner. I came up and was radicalized during the sort of the back end of the anti-globalization era. And my experience at that time was that there was just a lot of information and a lot of people with more experience than me who were acting in the roles of teachers and mentors, creating materials that were just saturating movement with tools and resources and ways of thinking that helped us act in a stronger manner, helped us be bold, and have a more of a common understanding. I feel like that sort of era and that sort of way of doing things has changed. I would specifically mark like Occupy as a moment where things significantly shifted from this time where we have like a lot of more experienced organizers that have been around doing stuff for a while, passing on that wisdom and knowledge and sort of building out these alternative institutions, to these sort of emerging movements that kind of bubble up and kind of like overflow the banks of what, we who kind of see ourselves as maybe like stewards of movement over a longer period of time, the overflow the banks of our like capacity to kind of guide and coach and help along. And in some ways that's really beautiful. We need to be able to release control and not feel like we own the directions that movement goes. I think that's really, really important. But then what that often means is that we're kind of reteaching and relearning as a movement the things that we just taught or learned or whatever 4 or 5 years ago. So I would say that there's people that are working now on Line 3 stuff to which, are so new that they like missed Standing Rock, for example. And now is their moment that they're kind of being radicalized and coming into things. And so how do we sort of carry those lessons forward in a positive, healthy way without attachment to, or expecting that we know better than anyone else, but just also being able to share and offer the experience that we have. So I guess in that way I feel mixed. I feel like there's been a lot of emerging movements that have not, sort of like clicked in with other movement infrastructure in really successful ways. And then there's some ways that the movement has. Yeah, I feel like this could be a whole hour-long conversation about like the ways that that's been successful and ways that it hasn't. But I think that in my sort of perception, this workbook plays a role in sort of saying, hey, here's what we kind of know about. And we tried really in the workbook to let go of ideas of that things need to be a certain way or that you should always do it the way that we think about doing it, and really open up ideas, really open up, hey, we have all this knowledge in our movement, and some of it is coming from the creativity of people that are seeing our movement with fresh eyes, and that's really super valuable. So how do we say, hey, here's kind of the things that we know, here's what's worked and what hasn't worked, and here's kind of why we think it has worked or hasn't worked. Now collaborate with us, now take the lessons that we've sort of learned and make some new mistakes, advance these sort of ideas, try out some different more creative solutions that aren't as entrenched in sort of our decade of slogging through movement the way that we think it should go. And let's collaborate on trying to find new paths forward that are going to meet the emerging needs of a changing world.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and I'm Burst. You're listening to my chat with Garrett from Pipeline Legal Action Network. Yeah, I really appreciate how the guide is so flexible. Like it, and it, I don't know, looking through, or it's not a guide. Actually, I was going to make the point that it's like not so much a guide as it is like a workbook, literally, where it's got all these exercises and just sort of like go back to your like affinity group, have this conversation. What are your shared strategies and like what kind of tactics do you want to take and what are your boundaries and what are your weak points? Like it seems to really be an awesome tool for someone to have in their hands, and because it's so flexible and provides so many kind of like choose your own adventure approaches to things that are based in so much collective experience, that different crews are going to could radically take these, like the guy or the workbook, in their own directions, and it could look, the way that it was filled out by one crew could look radically different from the way that it's filled out by another crew that's working on the same overall like project, like blocking pipeline 3 or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's exactly the point. You know, you mentioned our sort of shared values and our guiding principles, and, you know, a big part of our values is trying to get knowledge and materials and resources decentralized so that people can make decisions for themselves. You know, as an anarchist, I think that it's really important that people feel not just empowered to make decisions for themselves, but responsible for making decisions for themselves, you know, and responsible for the outcome of those decisions. So now you have this knowledge, you understand, you're responsible for the likely outcomes of the actions that you take. How are you going to act in a way that then best positions you to deal with those outcomes?
And even for folks, like I would suggest that anyone listening download the guide, or I'm going to keep calling it a guide, download the workbook and just check it out. Because even if you're not actively in resistance against a pipeline like this, like line 3, it's got so many snippets in there that are, you could build out a bunch of different know your rights presentations out of it. Yeah, there's just so much to think about in it. I applaud y'all for all the work that you put into constructing it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, so people can go to planline3.com. That's our website. And there's a resources tab, or just go straight to planline3.com/resources. And the guide is right there. The workbook is right there at the top of the page, free for people to download and, you know, take back to their crew. I do want to say that in some ways the process of making this workbook, it was less of a generating material. There was a little bit of material generated, but it was mostly a curating. So, I mean, I think I want to especially give props, you know, when I was coming up, the Midnight Special Law Collective, they, you know, they've since disbanded, but the work that they did during their time, you know, I still go to their website whenever a new campaign is emerging to kind of reperuse their information that they put together, you know. The Civil Liberties Defense Center, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Indigenous Peoples Power Project, Mutant Legal Collective, Ruckus Society, you know, all of these different groups created tools that are a part of our shared movement, knowledge, wisdom, and experience that, you know, we just kind of put together so that people that are new, that are kind of looking for, hey, where do I look for these types of tools? We can say, hey, here's some people that have, you know, have done some really good work, and we can kind of point you towards those people. So it's very little of this is plan per se. The experience that plan brings is more, hey, we know where the people are, where the groups are that have been successful. And so let's kind of draw on those resources. So I just, you know, make it clear that we are not in any way solely the architects of this work, but rather, you know, we inherited from all of those that came before us and are trying to like play our humble part in moving that work a little bit forward.
And so this is book 1. What are the other books that you're planning on releasing, and what's the sort of time frame for that?
Sure. So our plan as we sit here, you know, and I think it depends on the feedback that we get from this book, and, you know, how successful it is in meeting the needs that people have. But as we sit here today, our intention is to have three books: a pre-action, action concurrent, and a post-action. And so we want the book 2 will be kind of about what are the nuts and bolts of doing jail support during an action, and then book 3 will be more about court support and defense campaigns. And so anyone out there who's listening that, has interest or experience in those areas, is encouraged to connect with us and help us put this stuff together. It is very much a collective and collaborative process. We're also interested in any other help with graphic design or layout or things like that people want to collaborate with us around. We want to keep it cheap and easy to print out so people can use it a lot and then burn it or do whatever they need to do with it, because it's meant to be worked with, not just read and then put on a shelf. So you might need a couple copies for yourself as you walk through movement in the future. So it's consider this your formal invitation to reach out to us. We have an email, planline3@gmail.com, and get a hold of us if you want to be a part of working on this project.
Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you wanted to talk about?
I guess I would just kind of add that as we're doing this work around line 3, and we're specifically focusing on legal work, and by that we mean, from the moment you come in contact with the police to the moment everyone is off paper and out of supervision. It's important to recognize that while this line 3 struggle is going on and sort of like the moment of conflict is existing, that there are other parts of our shared same movement that are in different phases. So whether that's Red Fawn, who is still doing time from Standing Rock, or even going further back to our movement elders like Leonard Peltier, who is still in prison and still in need of regular support. It's part of our job, and how we win is by having these successes that mean we win more than we lose. And so as people are serving this time, we need them to know that we're with them and that we as a movement are capable of supporting them and standing with them through the whole process, even post-release, helping make sure that they are able to move on with their lives in the best possible way. I know you've had Project Fang on, and I would just give a shout to them. They're doing really great work to try to fill some of those gaps as well. So this is encouragement too. If we work on trying to help build prisoner literacy, just around knowing who your political prisoners are that came before you, that have a lot of wisdom to share, and that many of your peers may find themselves in similar situations in the future. And so how you support these movement elders and how you're able to support your peers as they struggle, is going to be a big part of whether or not our movements are successful in the long run.
Cool. Well, Garrett, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for having this chat with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate your work. I'm humbled to be in the realm of people that you talk to, along with all these other great comrades that are doing such great work in the world, and happy to be able to make the contributions where I feel able.
Awesome. Well, mutual inspiration. If you're listening to the show and you appreciate what you're hearing, please consider making a donation to the Final Straw Radio. We are a volunteer effort, but the funds that we get helps us to promote the project, and to buy equipment, and hopefully eventually to be able to travel a bit, to be able to do better coverage outside of our 9 to 5 or 5 to 9 jobs. So we have a link up on our website. If you go to finalstrawradio.noblogs.org and you click on the donate/merch button, you can pretty easily see some ways up there. You could make a one-time contribution through Venmo or through PayPal. There's also an opportunity to do recurring payments through Patreon, and we do have some thank you gifts that are up there, like sticker packs, including stickers for our project to help get more people and the general public aware, or just put up on your toolbox or laptop or whatever, as well as pretty cool stickers from anti-fascist, ecological, feminist, queer, anti-police messaging and projects from all around. And we also sell the Sean Swain bumper stickers, Sean Swain 2020. They're pretty heavily discounted and pretty sweet. And I'm sure that the cop cars in your neighborhood would hate to have them pasted on them. So yeah, you can go and find out more on that link, and we appreciate it. And another way that you can help, if you feel like helping out, is share this project with other people. It helps us to get more listeners so that we can, get this stuff into more people's ears and help spread some of the ideas that our guests talk about. And it helps, it just generally helps to amplify the voices of the people involved. It's free to just tell someone else about the project or promote it on social media, pass it on to someone else. Another free way to help us out is we air this show, or a cleaned up version of this show, on about 9 stations, little radio stations around the U.S. They tend to be community-oriented, kind of leftist, progressive, social justice-y outfits that are volunteer-run. And considering the way that media has operated in the United States for the last 20 years or so, we feel like engaging with people who are on the ground, frontline, engaged in struggles, and who have really good ideas, and getting these ideas out there, like even if they're not competing at the same level as things like Fox News or Rush Limbaugh, that we are working to slowly build our own networks, our poor little underfunded networks of counter-information and liberatory media. So getting in touch with one of those community radio stations and turning them on to us would be super helpful. There's a free downloadable version of our show available to all the Pacifica affiliates through AudioPort. And it's also available on archive.org every week for free. A 58-minute version of the show that's cleaned up for FCC. And if you go to the website, to our website, finalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and click radio broadcasting, you can find some pretty easy information that you can pass on to a local community radio station. Community radio stations are meant to be reflective of the communities that they're involved in. So I'm sure it wouldn't hurt for them to hear from one of their listeners that you'd like to hear us up on the air. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.